Which historical tragedy were you weirdly obsessed with as a child? The plague. Any plague really, they were quite common, but in this case the Black Death. It gave me a reverence and interest for disease in general, and it showed how powerless humans are against something so minuscule and seemingly invisible. No one knew how to protect themselves or how diseases spread, so they came up with all sorts of theories and cures. If you were a normal person back then in a highly religious Europe, you would think the end times were surely near. The atmosphere among the general population must have been really bleak. Also, those plague doctor uniforms just looked really cool. Same, I found the plague and Spanish flu fascinating, that humanity was at the mercy of nature. And here we are now, desperately fighting the same battle. Have you ever read Samuel Pepys' diary? It has a lot in it, including his observations of the plague decimating society and how things changed and evolved, and how he managed to actually do well because of it. It's free online if you look for it. Titanic for me as well. I'd say it was the start of the weirdly obsessed historical tragedies that I have even to today. I remember the National Geographic about it and even had a model Titanic ship that I'd pretend to sink in the bathtub. The movie ruined it for me for a number of years, as it for a teenage me associated Titanic as a girly film. But now that I'm older and don't care, I've been back into watching stuff again about the Titanic. Historic Travels on YouTube has a lot of good videos about it and other shipwrecks. From a Google search, Sarah Graves, who, as a member of the snowshoe party known as the Forlorn Hope, wandered the Sierra Nevada for over a month in the winter of 1846–47 to bring news of the Donner Party's entrapment. Brown uses a novelist's tools to recreate the sufferings of Sarah and her family, extraordinarily hardy people, who independently traveled west from Illinois before they met up with the Reed and Donner wagons in midsummer. 7. He packs each page with details of Sarah's world, from choosing which of 3 types of flower to bring to marriage customs to daily trail routines, minutiae that become less important as winter snows progress and the snowshoe party sets out on its desperate journey. Within days of leaving camp, the snowshoe party is lost and suffering from snow blindness. Brown focuses on their deteriorating mental state and squalid hygienic conditions, meditates on the psychology and science of hunger, and offers new theories on the group's sufferings. He speculates that members of the group likely died of hypothermia, a condition of overheating caused by the body's rise in temperature during heavy exertion, such as scaling mountain ridges. This, in combination with the contrasting effects of hypothermia, brought about by exposure to extreme winter weather, could have contributed to their willingness to cannibalize the dead only 6 days after running out of food. The Mary Celeste story always creeped me out. It was an American merchant ship in 1861 that went missing. That was pretty common in those times, so it wasn't a big deal, but later, the time frame, it was found adrift with all the crew missing. But there was not even a hint of any disturbances, and food was actually found on the table ready to be served, so it looked as if the crew just all vanished one day mid-sailing. There was also no valuables took, so it was clear that nobody invaded it. I'd just always found it weird. I wrote a paper on this. If you don't want your bubble burst, stop reading now. There's one theory that has a couple things to take note of. 1. The lifeboat was missing and a tattered rope was dragging behind the abandoned ship. 2. The cargo that was being carried is a critical consideration. So what happened? The ship was carrying lots of barrels of industrial alcohol. Some of the barrels were standard, white oak barrels. However, some were made of a much more porous red oak, many of which were found to be empty or near empty when the ship was discovered adrift. So what happened is that the porous barrels were leaking fumes, or the alcohol was soaking through the wood and vaporizing, evaporating, not sure on the word here. It probably didn't give off much of an odor, but those fumes are extremely dangerous in the hull of a ship like that. This was not unheard of at the time. So one day the gases reached dangerous levels, something causes a spark, possibly a door latch smacking into something too hard, and the fumes ignite. There's somewhat of an explosion but no real damage is done. It's just a quick flash fire. The crew realizes what's happening and fears another explosion. So they jump in the lifeboat, tied with a rope hanging off the stern of the ship, and they all get in. Their goal is to wait it out for a while. Unfortunately, a storm comes up and the rope snaps. The crew drifts away in the lifeboat or it sinks, and the Mary Celeste continues on, left as it was the moment the crew jumped into a lifeboat. I'm obsessed because it's one of my first memories. I have this vivid memory of a guy with black bubbles on his skin, and then soon after, Indiana Jones came out. You remember the scene where everyone's face melts? I just assumed that was radiation. Then we moved to a place near a power plant that had several issues that was located in such a way to prevent residential escape. There are 2 bridges off my area and it would lead us right to the plant. Then we were in the Gulf War learning about what nuclear bombs were. My childhood was a nightmare. Last year was the 40th anniversary of the eruption of Mount St. Helens, the worst such disaster in U.S. history. I'm getting old enough to remember events I witnessed live on television like this that are considered old, like I view things like the Kennedy assassination. I keep thinking about the devastation caused, the awe-inspiring, sheer power of the thing, and tried to put it in perspective for myself thus. If I picked up a rock about the size of a baseball and threw it at somebody's head, they might be severely injured, or even killed, by that action. What is that, a pound or 2? 50 miles per hour if hurled by my noodle arms? Now, the Mount St. Helens eruption displaced 2.7 cubic kilometers of material, 2.1 billion metric tons of rock, some of it molten, and it's hurtling at your face at near supersonic speed. May 18, 1980, 8:32 a.m. It's not a specific event, but I was flat obsessed with the Bermuda Triangle as an elementary school kid. I read more than 50 books on it. I was scared to death of it. I was convinced that all airplanes and boats were in serious danger if they went through it. I assumed they all actively went around it every day. I couldn't figure out why it was happening, but it must be serious. As someone who lives in Florida and travels by both plane and boat through it, pre-COVID, a few times a year, this life is not one I expected. It was way more important to preaching me than it really is, which is not at all. Same here. Despite developing a deep fear of volcanoes, I couldn't stop reading about them or Mount Vesuvius in particular in 3rd grade. I had nightmares and got startled whenever I heard even the hint of something rumbling. Funny bit is, I eventually ended up standing on a volcano, Mount Sakurajima, when I traveled to Japan at 22. It's generally safe to be on one side of it, even though it's a pretty active volcano. I happened to be there when it had a small, regular eruption and flipped the fuck out while everybody else seemed pretty leisurely as they went to their respective cars to leave. Haven't had a volcano nightmare since. The U.S. Civil War. My great-aunt gave me a copy of a book called The Yankee Saddle, by Vernon Howard, to read when I was a kid. She's been given it by her Sunday school teacher when she was young. It's a Christian youth book. I think she wanted me to pay more attention to the Christian message in the book, but instead I read it, and was pretty much instantly obsessed with all things Civil War. Movies, books, music, poetry. Then my dad gave me a copy of Battle Cry of Freedom, The Civil War Era by James M. McPherson for my birthday when I turned 12, and I devoured it. When I was 14, we moved to America for a year or so, and Dad and one of his co-workers took me on a Civil War historical battlefield tour, and it was like my Disneyland. We watched it live when I was in 3rd grade. We all made little American flags out of construction paper and put them on straws to hold. A teacher on board better believe we were watching it in school. Watching it and having the teachers first confused and then shouting and turning off the TV was terrible and memorable. We weren't 100% sure what had happened. This was the first launch I had ever seen. All the smoke and there was almost no reaction from the commentator. I've watched it only once since then and the voice from NASA, I think, says obviously a major malfunction has happened or something like that. I kinda remember that being the terrifying part to me. Just this calm voice describing an awful tragedy. I know this was his job and how he was trained to handle it, but Jesus. I was, well, still am, to be honest, Obsessed with dirigibles as a kid. I remember getting salty in middle school history class because the Hindenburg wasn't even the worst airship crash, just the most publicized. I campaigned for the creation of a new passenger airship line for a project in 8th grade. Unfortunately, due to Hindenburg-related bad press, the idea was not exactly well received by my class, and between helium shortages and sheer cost inefficiency these days, it seems unlikely that could ever come to fruition. It's not a piece of history. The U.S. is still actively attempting to eradicate the Native American way of life by forcing them to integrate into modern American society. They intentionally create extreme poverty on the Native American reservations, then offer them ways to escape that poverty that all involve leaving their tribe and reservation and integrating into modern society. The U.S. then seizes land granted to the natives by treaty in order to build oil pipelines or start mining operations, and sends in the National Guard and other security forces to brutalize the natives when they resist the seizure of their land. If he is still as obsessed when he is older, take him to Washington, D.C. for a Lincoln assassination visit. There is a lot to see, assuming it is still as it was when I lived in the area. You can go to the theater where he was shot and see a small performance while sitting in the same chairs that were there on that night. In the basement there is a museum dedicated to that night. A lot of memorabilia. It includes the bloody coat he was wearing. For me, the bloody coat was way over the top, too real and immediate, but most people don't react so strongly. Anyway, for Lincoln assassination buffs, there is a lot to make a great trip for a couple of days. The Lake Nyos disaster. Without warning, and for reasons not exactly known, a lake in Cameroon basically exploded with CO2 in the middle of the night in 1985. It killed almost 2,000 people by asphyxiating them in their sleep, not to mention the incredible amount of livestock and animal life that also died. Essentially, a cloud of carbon dioxide, and possibly some other gases, spewed out of the lake and kept close to the ground, and just wiped a few villages. It blew my mind that a lake could hold gas like that, and then also release it. I first read about it in National Geographic, and I must have read that article 100 times. I've watched many a documentary on it. It still somewhat fascinates me in a morbid sort of way. It's a very unique kind of natural disaster, and not many of its kind have been witnessed. I think it was the Joy Luck Club book I read in 7th grade where the author's mother was recounting her experience with China's Cultural Revolution. It just seemed so surreal and impossible that it actually happened. The idea that a regular society could just be taken over and destroyed by a raging mob of dogmatic idiots was terrifying. It seemed impossible, like how could the sane just be overridden? Cut to today, Trump, the mask bullshit, denying people's rights in Jesus' name. Didn't think I'd see it illustrated in my lifetime and in the U.S. There was a series of popular children's books in my country that dealt with childhood friendships during historical time of war. It was mostly World War II, but my favorite one was one that dealt with the military dictatorship in my country, from 1967–1974. They tortured, exiled and killed a lot of people. The book had a graphic description of the protagonist's godfather, that was imprisoned and tortured for his liberal views. It kinda scarred me and made me know a lot more. I was 10 or so. The Titanic. As I've seen others say, I remember watching A Night to Remember as a little kid, and for some reason, I was just oddly fascinated by it. I even had Polar the Titanic bear my dad found for me at the flea market. I was, of course, obsessed with the Titanic movie. It's still kind of a thing that stuck throughout the years. Several years ago at Barnes & Noble's I picked up Titanic Remembered 1912–2012. It was a large book full of info. It also came with blueprints, replicas of tickets, etc. The other one that comes to mind is Jack the Ripper. I did my senior paper on it. I don't even remember how it qualified, but we were allowed to choose any topic. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. started in grade 5 when I found a book on 2 girls who survived Hiroshima. I don't remember much from the book except the firebomb hoods the girls carried to school with them, thick canvas covered in leather to make it less likely the embers from the American firebombings would catch the girls' hair on fire. While firebombings were cool, the nukes were what stole my interest. So much destructive power kept in such small a package. The devastation of Ground Zero, the shadows left on the concrete from the people vaporized. I got obsessed with nuclear theory and nuclear weapons history. Still am. I've learned to not share my obsession openly, but if people want to talk about the craziness of maddened American nuclear doctrine ... I got all night. During the early years things were super ad hoc. After the war the US didn't have a formal production line or chain of command or deployment doctrine. There was the Los Alamos lab and test range. In such alpha stages of production, when inspectors came around they found half-assembled nukes hastily tarped and left in the mud while it rained. Meanwhile, every branch of the military wants their own big bombs to play with, including but not limited to. The Army wanted a nuclear landmine for tanks. The Air Force wanted nuclear Su-52 and air-to-air rockets for dogfights and interception. The Navy wanted nuclear torpedoes for deleting battleships. The Marines wanted to use small tactical nukes for denial of area, mainly cutting impassable borders between supply lines. Think the divide from Fallout New Vegas Lawrence Road. Meanwhile, the actual ownership of the nukes and their materials was the Department of Energy. This is because of a bunch of bureaucracy about nuclear power plants and hiding the production process of weapons. All this mixed with a healthy amount of human error and ignorance. For several years the launch code for all American nukes was 00000. While formally there was supposed to be an uncrackable code. Base commanders did not want such a technicality to impede an attack, hence the default zeros. Incidents of lost nukes, misplaced nukes, one Joe Bob borrowing what he thought was a training nuke to show his girlfriend, even showed a guy at the base gated under a tarp in his pickup. The training nukes and real nukes were stored next to each other in the same storage lockup. Guess what mistake this dude made? The rise of the Third Reich in Nazi Germany. I remember being in 7th grade, reading this 500-page book about Hitler. I was so obsessed and intrigued by the whole period. I remember watching Schindler's List in the theater and getting the VHS to watch it on loop. I especially loved Ralph Fiennes' representation of the Nazi war criminal Amon Goeth. I don't think it truly clicked with me how heinous the acts and crimes against humanity was at that age. I remember my sister, who was 6 years older than me, asked how I would feel if some officers came to our house, separated us from our parents and sent us to concentration camps because we are Mexican. I think that's when it clicked. The Holocaust. I had read the diary of Anne Frank when I was 12 and felt numb with shock when I reached the last page, where they detailed what happened to her after the annex was discovered. Cue an intense Wikipedia study session followed by books and movies and whatnot. The massive and senseless loss of life and innocence for mere ideology made me question everything taught to me and the stereotypes I had grown up with. Still cannot go through 12th of June every year without sparing some thought to the massive suffering and sheer destruction it brought about. Not me, but my school did a grade-wide presentation on the Civil War where each group got a new topic, for example propaganda during the war, and while working the teacher brings the example board on the Holocaust in to show us what to do. Later some kids enter the library where we work. One of them, about 6 seconds old, was staring intently at the Holocaust board. During the presentation the kid walked up and asked, "Where's the Holocaust?" And we all started laughing. To this day Holocaust kid is an inside joke with my friends. When the UK exited the exchange rate mechanism in 1992 on an event called Black Wednesday, I could not understand how they let it get so far. At the time I worked on FX trading floors. In fact I was on a customer's trading floor that day, Deutsche Bank in Frankfurt. Nobody understood it really what happened, until a few days later when I was told that Chancellor was an idiot and John Major out of his depth. I did not believe that, refused to admit to myself that you will be so callous at your job. Years later I saw a documentary, and Kenneth Clark, who was the Home Secretary at the time, explained that he was in somebody's office, and they asked if anybody had a radio so they can follow what the news is regarding the event. The tragedy of British politics is fascinating.